She stood frozen in the doorway, blonde hair catching the sunlight, designer suit unable to mask her trembling hands. 200 tattooed men, former gang members turned military veterans, filled her pristine suburban lawn, standing in military formation, silent, watchful, waiting. All because Karen Wilcox, 40-year-old president of Maple Creek Estates Homeowners Association, had called Elena Rodriguez neighborhood trash and destroyed a memorial to her fallen daughter. Now Karen faced the consequences no HOA manual had prepared her for. The day her suburban power trip collided with street justice wrapped in legal authority. What happens when an HOA president discovers the immigrant family she's been terrorizing has a son who leads 200 reformed gangsters with government badges? Maple Creek Estates wasn't just another suburban enclave. It represented the pinnacle of American retirement success. With home values averaging $850,000 and immaculate streets lined with matching mailboxes, it embodied what decades of hard work could achieve: security, uniformity, and exclusivity. For nearly a decade, Karen Wilcox had transformed her volunteer position as HOA president into a personal kingdom. The 40-year-old former corporate compliance executive ran the association with ruthless efficiency, wielding the covenant rulebook like a weapon. Despite her relatively young age, her platinum blonde hair and designer suits projected an authority that made even retirees twice her age defer to her demands. "I've devoted my career to maintaining standards," Karen reminded everyone at the monthly meetings, manicured nails tapping against her gold-embossed property manual. "This community represents our shared values and standards of living, and I won't allow anyone to challenge the system of order we've all committed to maintaining." Her system worked flawlessly until the Rodriguez family purchased the smallest home in the community, using their entire life savings plus a loan from their son. Manuel, a decorated Vietnam veteran and retired postal worker, and his wife Elena, who had escaped political persecution in her home country, represented something Karen hadn't anticipated: diversity in her carefully cultivated community. "The house was in foreclosure," complained Karen to her inner circle over wine. "The bank should have vetted buyers more carefully. There goes the neighborhood." What nobody in Maple Creek realized, what would soon upend their comfortable existence, was that the Rodriguez family had connections extending far beyond their quiet suburban street. Connections that would transform their community in ways no one could imagine. The conflict began with what should have been beyond reproach: a small memorial garden Elena created in the corner of their backyard. Partially visible from the street, the garden honored their daughter Maria, who had died of leukemia during her service in the Army Special Forces. The colorful ceramic figures, candles, and marigolds surrounding Maria's military portrait were part of their cultural tradition honoring fallen heroes. The first violation notice appeared within 48 hours of the garden's completion. Section 8, Paragraph C clearly prohibits unauthorized structures and non-approved landscaping elements. Karen had written in bold red marker across the top: "Remove immediately or face escalating penalties starting at $100 day." Manuel, still wearing his postal service uniform after his shift, walked the 3 blocks to Karen's house, Maria's military photo and Purple Heart in hand. "Ms. Wilcox," he began respectfully on her porch, "I'd like to explain about the garden. It honors our daughter who died serving our country. Perhaps there's a provision for memorial." Karen examined her manicure without inviting him inside. "I don't care if she was the president's daughter," she replied, handing back the photo without glancing at it. "Rules are rules. Remove it by Friday or face fines." When the shrine remained, Karen escalated her campaign with military precision. First came daily photographs documenting the violation from various angles. Then public shaming at the HOA meeting. Finally, while the couple attended Sunday Mass, maintenance workers entered their property to remove a rosebush Elena had planted using clippings from Maria's funeral arrangement. The confrontation that followed was captured on 3 different neighbors' security cameras. Elena, still in her church clothes, approached Karen at the community mailboxes. "You destroyed her favorite flowers," Elena sobbed, clutching wilted rose stems. "How could you do this to a memorial for our child?" Karen's response, delivered loudly enough for everyone at the mailboxes to hear, would later be described as the match that lit the fuse. Perhaps in your country, people ignore laws when it's convenient, Karen replied, looking down through designer reading glasses. But this is America. If you can't respect our rules, you should go back to wherever you came from. What Karen didn't notice was Frank Willis, the retired federal judge who lived next door to the Rodriguez family, recording every word on his phone. Or that his daughter worked for the Department of Housing and Urban Development's Civil Rights Division. The violation notices will continue until you comply, Karen added, turning away. This neighborhood has standards that were established long before you arrived. The situation reached its breaking point at the July HOA meeting. Elena stood nervously before the board and 24 residents, holding her daughter's military portrait and medal. Please, I just need 3 minutes to explain why this memorial is protected under both federal housing regulations and the Service Members Civil Relief Act. Karen cut her off mid-sentence, rapping her gavel. Your inability to follow simple rules isn't a cultural issue, Mrs. Rodriguez. It's a respect issue. If you can't read the covenant in English, perhaps you shouldn't have purchased it in an English-speaking community. Gasps echoed through the community center as Karen continued. People like you don't understand what this community stands for, she said, voice dripping with contempt. We work our whole lives to create order and dignity, and then people like you try to bring your chaotic customs into our carefully structured world. Elena clutched her daughter's military photo to her chest and rushed out, tears streaming down her face. Manuel followed, posture rigid with the dignity of a man who had endured worse but never expected it in his own community. At the door, he turned to address the silent room. My daughter died serving this country, he said, voice breaking. She believed in an America that respected all its citizens. I wonder what she would think of how you honor her sacrifice. As the door closed behind them, the temperature in the room seemed to drop. For the first time, several board members exchanged troubled glances. Thomas Sullivan, a retired cardiologist who had rarely challenged Karen, cleared his throat. Karen, he began cautiously, that comment about trash was completely inappropriate and potentially— Next agenda item, Karen interrupted, slamming her gavel. The Rodriguez violation will be handled through legal channels, including potential lien procedures. What nobody noticed was Frank Willis quietly sending the video recording to both his daughter at HUD and an email address none of them would have recognized, until it was far too late. That evening, Elena's hands trembled so badly she could barely dial the number. She had promised herself she would never burden her son with their problems. He had his own life to lead, his own battles to fight. But this was too much to bear alone. Miguel, she said between sobs, I'm sorry to bother you with our problems, but something has happened. On the other end of the line sat her son, Miguel Rodriguez, in his corner office with views of the Boston skyline. Once a troubled teenager who had enlisted alongside his sister Maria, Miguel had transformed his life through education and determination. The GI Bill had taken him first to college, then Harvard Law. Few in Maple Creek remembered the skinny kid who used to deliver their newspapers. None knew what he had become. Mom, slow down, he said, motioning to his paralegal to clear his afternoon schedule. Tell me exactly what happened. Miguel listened intently as Elena described the shrine's destruction and the public humiliation. His office remained silent except for the scratch of his Mont Blanc pen taking detailed notes. His face, usually carefully composed for courtroom battles, darkened with each detail. He glanced at the old tattoo on his forearm, a reminder of his past in the streets before the military had given him purpose. Why didn't you call me sooner? He asked gently when she finished. We didn't want to burden you with our small problems, Elena replied, her voice small. And talking about Maria, it would just remind you of losing her too. Miguel's gaze drifted across his office to 3 framed items hanging in perfect alignment. His own Purple Heart beside Maria's posthumous Silver Star, his Harvard Law diploma, and a photograph of his former gang brothers, the Defenders, an organization formed from his old street comrades who had followed him into military service and later into law enforcement, now united by both their troubled pasts and their commitment to protecting the vulnerable. Send me everything, he said, voice shifting to the commanding tone that had made him a legendary prosecutor. The HOA documents, every notice, Frank's video. Everything. Miguel, please, no trouble, Elena pleaded. We just want to live in peace. Mom, Miguel replied, his voice suddenly reminiscent of the decorated captain he had once been. What they did dishonors Maria's memory and violates at least a dozen federal laws. This ends now. After hanging up, Miguel made 3 calls in rapid succession. First to Judge Sarah Whitman, the defender's co-founder and a federal housing discrimination specialist. Then to Marcus Johnson, the FBI's lead investigator on white-collar crime. Finally to Representative David Chun, a fellow veteran who had championed legislation protecting Gold Star families from discrimination. With one encrypted message to the defender's secure communication channel, he activated a protocol they had developed but never fully deployed. Operation Homecoming. By Saturday morning, subtle shifts appeared in Henderson County. The Sunrise Motel, which normally sat half-empty, displayed a no-vacancy sign. The local diner reported record breakfast sales, mostly to polite strangers with visible tattoos and gang insignias who tipped generously. Gas stations saw a steady stream of custom vehicles with Latino gang identifiers filling their tanks. At the Maple Creek Community Pool, whispers circulated about unusual activity. Several residents reported seeing convoys of SUVs and lowriders at the county line. Others mentioned Latino strangers photographing Karen's house and the HOA office. I heard there's some kind of Latino gang, whispered Judith Peterson to her husband as they adjusted their pool chairs. Perhaps we should call the police. For what crime? Asked Frank Willis, overhearing as he lowered himself into the water. No laws being broken, just folks passing through. As concerned residents gathered around him, Frank finally spoke his mind after 15 years of silent compliance. I've lived here since the community was built, he said slowly, and I've never questioned Karen's decisions. But what she said to the Rodriguez family crossed every line of decency and possibly several laws. He pulled out his phone and played the video of Karen's tirade. Many were hearing her exact words for the first time, unfiltered by neighborhood gossip. Did you know Elena volunteers 20 hours a week at the Veterans Hospital where her daughter used to receive treatment? Frank continued. Or that Manuel delivers meals to homebound seniors every weekend. They've lived the values we just talk about. Gerald Matthews, a retired school principal, shook his head in disbelief. I had no idea they lost a daughter in service. Karen made it sound like they were just being difficult about rules. That's the problem, Frank replied. We've confused rules with righteousness for too long. A text message alert interrupted their conversation. An emergency HOA meeting had been called for Sunday at noon. Subject: legal action against covenant violations and community security concerns. Karen's going to try to force them out, Thomas Sullivan realized aloud. She's actually going to try to evict a Gold Star family. Meanwhile, Karen remained oblivious to the gathering storm. She spent Saturday drafting formal eviction recommendations, citing willful and continued violation of community standards. Sunday's special meeting would be her moment to reassert authority and make an example of anyone who dared challenge her vision for Maple Creek. What she didn't notice was the black SUV with government plates parked across the street, or Judge Sarah Whitman inside methodically photographing everyone entering and leaving Karen's house, building what would become a devastating legal case. By Saturday evening, the county sheriff had received dozens of calls from worried residents about Latino gang members in the area. His response remained consistent. No laws being broken. We'll keep an eye on things. What she didn't tell callers was that his department had received a courtesy call from Miguel, not identifying himself as a Justice Department official, but as the former leader of the notorious East Side Defenders, a group that had transformed from street fighters into veterans and justice advocates. Whatever was happening had both street credibility and federal clearance at the highest levels. Online, the community message board exploded with speculation. Karen responded to concerned board members with dismissive reassurance. These types always make noise but rarely follow through. Besides, we have the law on our side. She had no idea how catastrophically wrong those words would prove to be. Sunday morning dawned with an unusual stillness. Karen dressed carefully in her finest navy pantsuit, the same one she'd worn when accepting the HOA President of the Year award. Today would require authority and presence to handle the Rodriguez situation, once and for all. At precisely 11:30 a.m., her security camera alerted her to movement at the community entrance. Karen checked the footage on her tablet and froze in terror. A convoy of black SUVs, custom lowriders, and sedans with tinted windows entered Maple Creek Estates. From them emerged wave after wave of Latino men with prison-style tattoos, shaved heads, and gang symbolism visible in their clothing and accessories. Despite their reformed lives as law enforcement officers and veterans, they maintained the intimidating appearance and solidarity of their street origins. The security footage revealed what looked like an invasion of a suburban community by an organized Latino street force. They arrived in waves, spreading out across the community with disciplined precision that betrayed their street organization. First 10, then 50, then over 100. By noon, more than 200 former Latino gang members still wearing their colors and identifiers had positioned themselves throughout Maple Creek, their convoy of cars and SUVs strategically parked to control all entry and exit points. Behind curtains and blinds, residents watched in amazement and fear. Security cameras captured what many would later describe as the most orderly invasion in history. The men, with their distinctive Latino gang tattoos, teardrop markings, elaborate script across necks and arms, and territory symbols, created a controlled but unmistakable aura of danger despite their disciplined silence. Their synchronized movements betrayed both military training and the street coordination of men who once operated within strict gang hierarchies. At the center of the formation came Miguel Rodriguez in a black Suburban with government plates. While maintaining his professional position, his street origins were evident in the respect shown by the former gang members, many with visible MS-13, Serenos, and other Latino gang identifiers. Despite his suit and credentials, the reformed street soldiers recognized one of their own who had risen to power. The club insignia on his lapel pin, scales of justice surrounded by barbed wire, hinted at their dual identity. Former gang members who had found purpose in military service and law enforcement. Beside him sat Judge Whitman, herself a former public defender who had represented many of these men in their youth. The men exited their vehicles in unison, their tattooed bodies and scarred faces telling stories of hard lives lived. The sea of gang colors and identifiers formed a wall of intimidating masculinity that would make anyone's blood run cold. Many had visible prison tattoos alongside military insignias, their dual past evident in their bearing. Some deliberately displayed gang symbols alongside newly earned badges, a visual reminder that these men walked in two worlds, the streets and the system. Karen's security camera captured her expression changing from annoyance to shock to absolute terror as she stood frozen in the doorway, her blonde hair catching the sunlight. She clutched the doorframe as she took in the sight before her. Approximately 200 Latino men with gang tattoos and prison-hardened expressions filling her pristine suburban lawn in perfect formation, silent, watchful, waiting. Though now operating within the law, their appearance and demeanor were unmistakably those of the streets, teardrop tattoos, elaborate script across necks and arms, and calculating stares that had once ruled urban territories. Miguel stood at the front, his expensive suit contrasting with the street soldiers behind him, the only hint of his connection to them being the partially visible tattoo on his wrist and the absolute respect with which they regarded him. It was the perfect visual embodiment of her worst nightmare coming to life on her doorstep. "Good morning, Ms. Wilcox," Miguel said when the door opened, extending his business card. Miguel Rodriguez, Deputy Director of the Justice Department's Housing Rights Division and JAG Corps Reserve Officer. "I believe we have some matters to discuss regarding your treatment of my parents and the federal laws you've been violating." Behind him, perfectly framed in Karen's security camera, stood several men whose aggressive posture and vigilant eyes surveyed the property with the practiced awareness of those who had survived the streets. One adjusted his jacket to reveal just a hint of a shoulder holster, while another's prison teardrop tattoo caught the sunlight. Their expressions carried the cold calculation of men accustomed to confrontation. "We have a noon appointment at your community center," Miguel continued pleasantly. "I believe you called the meeting. Shall we walk together, or would you prefer to drive?" Karen's security footage captured the exact moment her carefully constructed world began to collapse. The community center had never seen such attendance. Every seat was filled, with residents lining the walls. Outside, visible through every window, members of the defenders stood in formation, a visual reminder of the forces now aligned against the HOA leadership. "This is intimidation," Karen hissed as Miguel connected his laptop to the projector. "I'll have your law license for this circus." Miguel merely smiled. "Every person outside is here as a legal witness or subject matter expert. There are 14 federal judges, 26 FBI agents, 47 attorneys, and over 100 veterans who specialize in housing discrimination cases. This isn't intimidation, Ms. Wilcox, it's accountability." As residents settled, Miguel took the podium, his military bearing evident in his perfect posture and measured movements. "My name is Miguel Rodriguez. Many of you knew me as the paperboy 20 years ago. Today, I serve as Deputy Director for Housing Rights Enforcement and hold the rank of Lieutenant Colonel in the JAG Reserve Corps." Murmurs spread through the crowd as recognition dawned on the faces of longer-term residents. "Some of you knew my sister, Maria, who grew up here before joining the Army Special Forces. She died of leukemia contracted during her service in areas exposed to toxic materials. The garden shrine my mother created was in her memory, a protected expression under federal law." He clicked to the first slide, a photograph of Elena's destroyed garden juxtaposed with Karen's pristine koi pond, which violated the same covenant restrictions but had never received a violation notice. Under the Fair Housing Act, the Service Members Civil Relief Act, and the Americans with Disabilities Act, memorials to fallen service members receive special protections, even within HOA jurisdictions. Selective enforcement based on national origin constitutes federal discrimination. Karen stood abruptly. "We have clear covenants that..." "Federal law supersedes HOA covenants," interrupted Judge Whitman, rising from her seat. "As established in Harrington v. Westlake Community Association, 2018, and reinforced by the Gold Star Families Anti-Discrimination Act of 2023. "Who exactly are you?" Karen demanded. "Federal Judge Sarah Whitman, Ninth Circuit Court of Appeals," she replied calmly, "currently presiding over 3 class action suits against discriminatory HOA practices targeting protected classes." The room fell silent as the gravity of the situation became apparent. Miguel clicked to the next slide. "While investigating the discrimination against my parents, we discovered something disturbing that affects every homeowner in this room." The screen displayed bank statements, invoices, and transfer records from the HOA accounts spanning 5 years. "Ms. Wilcox has been systematically embezzling from your association funds. Our forensic accountants have documented approximately $1.2 million diverted to entities connected to her personal interests." Gasps echoed through the room as Miguel detailed the scheme. Landscaping contracts to Karen's brother-in-law at 40% above market rate. Security systems installed by companies where she owns significant stock. Phantom maintenance charges to shell companies tied to her late husband's estate. "We estimate each homeowner has overpaid approximately $6,000 in fraudulent assessments over the past 5 years," Agent Johnson added, stepping forward to display his FBI credentials. "We've been building this case for months after patterns emerged across multiple HOAs in the county." Karen lunged for the computer, but 2 defenders, both federal marshals, gently blocked her path. "This is absurd," she shouted. "You have no authority here." "Actually," Miguel said quietly, "everyone here has precisely the authority needed. These men who scare you, they've transformed their lives from the streets to service. Now they enforce the laws you've been breaking." He gestured to several men who opened their jackets slightly, revealing badges, credentials, and military decorations alongside their prison tattoos and gang markings. "The streets taught us loyalty and consequences. The system taught us how to use those principles to pursue justice." What happened next stunned even the most skeptical residents. Thomas Sullivan, the retired physician who served as HOA treasurer, slowly stood up. "I need to confirm something," he said, voice shaking. "I've suspected financial irregularities for months but was afraid to speak up. Karen threatened to reveal my daughter's past addiction struggles if I questioned the accounting discrepancies. One by one, other board members and residents rose to share similar stories. Threats, intimidation, selective enforcement based on who challenged Karen's authority or didn't fit her vision of suitable neighbors. Frank Willis played additional recordings revealing Karen's explicit strategy to maintain neighborhood character through targeted enforcement, a known code phrase for discriminatory practices in housing law. We have documented evidence of discriminatory enforcement against every homeowner of color in this community, Judge Whitman announced. Fines assessed at 3 times the rate, violations reported that were identical to those ignored on properties owned by white residents. The evidence was overwhelming and meticulously documented. With each revelation, Karen's supporters dwindled until she stood alone, her authority evaporating before everyone's eyes. But the most devastating testimony came from an unexpected source. "I have something to add," said a quiet voice from the back. The crowd parted to reveal Judith Peterson, Karen's closest friend and staunchest supporter for nearly a decade. "Karen told me we needed to protect our community's character and principles from those people," she said, tears streaming down her face. "She convinced me the Rodriguez family was the first wave of something that would undermine our way of life and the rules we all agreed to follow." Judith turned to Elena and Manuel Rodriguez seated in the front row. "I watched you tend that garden every morning. I saw you pray there for your daughter. And I said nothing when they destroyed it because I was afraid, not of you, but of standing up to Karen. I'm so deeply ashamed." She placed a small box on the table in front of Elena. "These are the ceramic angels from your memorial. I rescued them when the maintenance crew came. I've been wanting to return them, but I was too cowardly." The room fell silent as Elena opened the box, her hands trembling as she lifted out the small figures, the last birthday gift her daughter had given her before deployment. In that moment, something profound shifted in the room. What had begun as fear of outsiders transformed into recognition of a different threat. The corrosive power of unchecked authority and the silence that enabled it. "I've seen enough," Judge Whitman announced. "Agent Johnson, please proceed with the formal notification." As the FBI agent read Karen her rights regarding the financial crimes investigation, Miguel addressed the stunned community. "This was never about revenge," he said quietly. "This was about justice, not just for my parents, but for every resident who's been silenced, threatened, or made to feel unwelcome in their own home." He displayed one final slide, a blueprint for community transformation. "My organization doesn't just identify problems. We help build solutions. The question now is whether Maple Creek wants to become a model for what an inclusive, transparent community can be." The emergency board election took less than 30 minutes. Karen was removed by unanimous vote, replaced by a diverse 5-person council that included Manuel Rodriguez and Frank Willis. As the formal meeting concluded, Miguel addressed the subdued residents. "The legal process against Ms. Wilcox will continue, but the more important work begins now, rebuilding trust and community. My team has prepared a transition plan to help Maple Creek become a model for governance reform." Outside, the scene had transformed dramatically. The defenders, no longer standing in intimidating formation, had begun renovating the community's neglected playground, a project that had been under review for years despite collected funds. Teams of tattooed former gang members assembled equipment, planted flowers, and repaired benches. One group, led by a retired Marine Corps general, was painting a beautiful mural featuring service members of all backgrounds. "We stand together because we believe in something bigger than ourselves," Miguel explained to the curious residents who ventured outside. "Just like a neighborhood should be more than property values and lawn heights." The residents, hesitant at first, gradually joined the effort. Children who had been kept inside out of fear now worked alongside tattooed veterans to paint fences. Elderly homeowners shared lemonade with federal agents discussing community safety measures. Agent Johnson approached the newly elected board with unexpected news. "We've recovered most of the embezzled funds from offshore accounts. The question now is how you want to use them for community restoration." By late afternoon, the transformation extended beyond physical improvements. Residents who had lived as strangers for years discovered connections they never knew existed. A Vietnam veteran discovered Manuel had served in the same unit. A retired teacher learned Elena had been using her limited English to translate medical instructions for elderly Spanish-speaking patients at the local hospital. The most powerful moment came when a convoy of vehicles arrived, Gold Star families from across the state, bringing memorial items for Elena's garden. What had begun as one mother's tribute to her fallen daughter was becoming a sacred space for an entire community of grieving military families. "This is what Maria fought for," Elena whispered to Miguel as they watched the garden transform. "Not for rules or property values, but for people caring about each other." Over the following months, Maple Creek Estates became a case study in community transformation. The story of how a reformed Latino gang network of justice professionals had exposed corruption and discrimination attracted national attention. The new HOA board, led by Frank Willis, implemented sweeping reforms. Covenant enforcement was overhauled with clear anti-discrimination provisions. Financial transparency became mandatory, with quarterly audits by an independent firm. Most significantly, a cultural heritage committee was formed, with Elena as its chair, to celebrate the diverse backgrounds of residents. Monthly heritage dinners became the most popular community events, with residents sharing foods and traditions from different cultures. Manuel's Veterans Support Group connected isolated former service members with resources and companionship. The former violation reporting form was replaced with a neighbor assistance program, connecting residents with skills to those in need. Manuel's experience in home repair made him a neighborhood resource rather than a property standards problem. Property values did not decline as Karen had threatened. They increased by 12% over the next year as Maple Creek gained recognition as an inclusive, supportive community particularly attractive to retiring federal employees and military families. Most significantly, Miguel's organization of reformed gang members adopted Maple Creek as a regular stop on their annual community outreach. Each summer, hundreds of defenders would arrive not as intimidating outsiders but as welcomed friends, bringing resources for veterans and conducting free legal clinics for residents. Karen Wilcox eventually pled guilty to multiple charges of fraud, embezzlement, and civil rights violations. Her sentencing included full restitution to the community she had exploited and required community service hours working with immigrant integration programs. The judge, a member of the defenders, ordered that a portion of the restitution fund a scholarship in Miguel Rodriguez's name for children of veterans. At the first anniversary celebration, Elena stood beside the marble monument that now formed the centerpiece of the memorial garden. Engraved with Maria's name, it also bore the names of all service members connected to Maple Creek residents, creating a living history of the community's contributions to America. "When we lost Maria, I thought my heart would never heal," Elena told the gathered community. "But each of you has helped carry that burden by honoring her memory and the memory of all who served." Frank Willis, reflecting on the transformation in a national public radio interview, offered a perspective that resonated with listeners across the country. "We confused uniformity with unity," he admitted. "Our generation spent decades building our piece of the American dream without realizing that dream looks different to different people, but is no less valid. True security doesn't come from excluding others, but from creating community with them." For residents over 50 who had spent their lives working toward retirement security, the lesson was profound. Their security hadn't been threatened by newcomers with different traditions, it had been undermined by the very person claiming to protect them. As the sun set over the transformed Maple Creek Estates, the distinctive convoy of vehicles announced the arrival of the defenders for their annual visit. This time, instead of fear, residents lined the streets with welcome banners and applause. Miguel Rodriguez, now a nationally recognized advocate for housing equality, stepped out of his SUV and embraced his parents at the entrance to the community they had fought so hard to call home. "My sister gave her life defending American values," Miguel told the assembled residents and riders. "But it took 200 unlikely defenders to remind us what those values truly are: dignity, respect, and the understanding that justice isn't just a concept. It's an action." Elena placed her hand on the marble monument bearing her daughter's name, now surrounded by photos of service members from every background. Sometimes the most powerful force isn't found in legal documents or property codes, she said, her accent now a point of pride rather than shame. Sometimes it arrives bearing gang tattoos and badges, reminding us that behind every rule should stand one simple truth. We are all each other's neighbors. The camera panned across the diverse faces of the community, young and old, veterans and civilians, original residents and newcomers, all united around a garden once deemed an unauthorized structure, but now recognized as the beating heart of a transformed American neighborhood. Sometimes the most powerful justice comes when the streets and the system finally work together, when 200 ex-gangsters in government badges show up to remind a community what America truly stands for.